Hello and welcome to another Marshall Moment. My name is Rob Havers, the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, located here on the post at the Virginia Military Institute in lovely Lexington, Virginia. And I am delighted today to welcome Mel Leffler, the Edward Stettinius Professor of History from UVA. Mel, welcome to the Marshall Foundation. I know you are no stranger to this institution. It's great to have you back. What can you tell us about what you think about George C. Marshall?
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's actually been quite a few years since I first came here to do my research, a good 25 years ago,
wow.
actually. So actually my respect for George Marshall as a statesman and policymaker after the war actually has grown enormously over the years. And I would say, as I've studied the history of American foreign policy during the Cold War, as extensively as I have and as intensively as I have over the last 25 years, my appreciation for the way Marshall organized the policy-making process, for the way in which he strategically thought about American interests, and the ways in which he was able to incisively assess threats are incredibly impressive to me. And so I would say, and the theme of my lecture later today is going to be that he is really the most influential and determinative policymaker of the early Cold War years, by far, I would say. And I think he established the architecture and the framework for thinking about the Cold War that ultimately, long after he thought would be the case, won the Cold War.
That's a remarkable synopsis of what he did. And when you think that Marshall essentially is no longer involved in some sense in the Cold War by 1951, and the Cold War rumbles on until 1989. It's incredible that in that comparatively short space of time, Marshall's influence could be so substantial.
Yes, well, he designed the architecture and established the assumptions that would persist for a very long time. By that I mean to say that the essential architecture was determining that the most important thing that the United States needed to do was to support and facilitate the rebuilding of Western Europe and Western Germany on the one hand, and to rebuild and rehabilitate Japan on the other hand, and to tie both Western Europe and to Japan to the United States through a network of alliances. And his general view was that if you establish that framework based on interests and values that were shared by both Western Europeans and West Germans and post-war Japanese statesmen, if you establish a framework of interests and values, multilateral trade, non-discriminatory trade, the free flow of capital, respect for individual freedoms and representative government. If you could establish amongst these key nations a framework of shared values and interests and tie them to the United States through a network of alliances, you would establish essentially a preponderance of power that over the long run the Soviet Union would defer to and eventually decide to negotiate with.
Wow.
And I think that's, over a 40-year period, I think that is exactly what happened.
That's right. That's rather how it pans out. What has always fascinated me is, and I'd be fascinated to get your thoughts on this, is that until Marshall heads to China as the special representative, special envoy, he has been a soldier his whole career. And yet he's almost effortlessly seems to step from the military sphere, and it's a very Chief of Staff of the Army in World War II, a multifaceted role, but he seems effortlessly to step from the military to the civilian sphere and have an understanding of those things, you almost as though, where did that come from? Because he wasn't a policymaker, he wasn't a diplomat.
Well, one of the things as Chief of Staff of the Army, one of the most important things he knew, he learned and he knew, as all top generals eventually do, is that logistics and supply are critical to wartime effort. And what Marshall supervised during the war was not simply military tactics, but essentially organized incredibly complex economic industrial program. So he understood the importance of industry and economic resources to the fundamentals of power. He
Right.
knew that both as the military architect and Chief of Staff of World War II. He also learned during the war, as did Dwight Eisenhower, the essential importance of collaborating with and linking up with allies. He understood that the United States essentially did not win the war alone.
Right.
He understood that it took allies, that it took compromise, that it took accommodation, that it required empathy to understand what your allies were motivated by and what they needed. So I would say his experiences waging war as the Chief of Staff of the Army were very much critical
Right.
to the way he organized or wanted to organize the peace after the war.
Right, to the waging of the peace. It struck me as I was sitting down thinking about you coming this evening that if you broadly, if the Cold War is 49 to 89, say 40 odd years, we are now in the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down, and so the Cold War has been off almost as long, three quarters as long as it was on. How has our perception changed of the Cold War, Mel, over that time? And I'd say that as to one of the preeminent historians of the Cold War.
Well, I think what we've come to appreciate is the fundamental superiority of a marketplace economy linked to a strong social welfare state. And the combination of strong government plus markets had turned out, as really many top American policymakers assumed it would, that over the long run, it was just a superior framework for producing economic wealth and uplifting standards of living than a command economy. Policymakers from Truman to Reagan said that. Many scholars, especially on the liberal left and the radical left, I think often were skeptical about those basic assumptions, but actually over the long run, those assumptions proved to be true. What I want to emphasize, though, is that it was not simply the superiority of a market economy over a command economy. It was the coupling of a market economy with strong government and a safety net. What Truman and Marshall and Eisenhower and Kennedy all understood during the first 20 years of the Cold War. And so we're talking about both Republicans, moderate Republicans like Dwight Eisenhower, and Democrats, traditional Democrats from Truman to Kennedy. What they both understood was that you needed to bring together the strengths of a market economy with the ability of a strong government to provide a safety net from a market economy, and with the ability of a strong government to regulate the excesses and monitor the distribution effect of a market economy. So subsequently, I would say, after the Cold War, we tended to simplify and think that what won the Cold War was simply a market economy over a command economy. And I think one of the things that, when we look back carefully at the dynamics and history of the Cold War, was what was critical and what Truman understood and what the British post-war leaders understood, like Clement Attlee and Bevan, what they understood was that you needed both government and markets, and together they would prove the superiority over a command economy. And remember, the Cold War was essentially about the nature of political economy. The Cold War was about which type of political economy in a modern industrial era could provide the most uplift and enhance the standard of living of most people in the world. That's what it was about. And initially, during the early years of the Cold War, the Soviet leaders and communist leaders had a strong argument. Their argument was capitalism had essentially produced 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And whether you would accept or not accept those simplifications, a very substantial number of people around the globe believed that. And what democratic statesmen had to demonstrate to their people after World War II was that market economies mixed with a safety net and government regulation, they could prove their superiority. They would not lead to another global conflict amongst capitalist powers. They would not lead to another Great Depression. And I think that the great success of democratic leaders, not only in the United States, but in Western Europe and Japan and elsewhere, was to bring together the best of a market economy with the best of a safety net and government regulation to prove superiority.
Right. Excellent. Gentlemen, anything we need to add? That's a good chunk there. Okay, well, I'll do an outro, Mel.
Yeah.
Professor Mel Leffler, delighted you will be with us today. Thank you very much for this very insightful Marshall moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much.